The town of Barnsley in the heart of South Yorkshire was built on coal. In the mid-19th century it stood as a proud industrial powerhouse, smoke curling from chimneys, black dust settling on stone, and the rhythm of daily life shaped by the rumble of wagons and the clatter of pit boots. By the winter of 1866, the Oaks Colliery stood as one of the largest coal mines in Britain, a vast labyrinth of tunnels gaslit by danger and powered by men and boys. Life here beat to the rhythm of the mines. It was hard, unforgiving and generational. A father worked the pit, his sons followed, and the work bound communities together as tightly as it bound them to the coal beneath their feet. The Barnsley bed was the most famous seam in the South Yorkshire coalfield, reaching up to 3 metres thick in places, with a reputation for quality. But it came with its dangers. The Barnsley seam was gassy, notoriously associated with frequent outbursts of fire damp and the potential for explosions, making the challenge for those below ground incredibly dangerous. And one December day, something happened in those tunnels, something that shook Barnsley to its core. A disaster that would become the worst mining tragedy in English history, not just for the scale of the loss, but for what it revealed about sacrifice, duty, and how far people will go to try and save their own.
Hello friends and welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, I'm Claire and this is the Wanderlust way. Firstly, let me say thank you to everybody that supports this channel by liking, commenting, subscribing and sharing. Everything that you do helps the channel to grow and it allows me to continue bringing you these stories. Now today is the second episode in our Yorkshire's worst pit disasters. Last week, if you watched it, we visited the village of Silkstone, where the tragedy hit, the Husker pit disaster, killing 26 children in a flood. That was 1838. Now today we are moving forward by 28 years to the year 1866, and we're around 10 miles from Silkstone in the town of Barnsley. This is the story of the Oaks Colliery disaster, which didn't just change a town, it changed the whole country's perception on mine safety and rescue operations forever. Now let's go back to that cold December day and the mine that became a grave. So that's enough waffle, let's wander.
In the mid-19th century, Barnsley was a coal town through and through. The pit shaped everything, the landscape, the routine, the very breath in people's lungs. Boys were born into coal, fathers, grandfathers, uncles, all miners. It wasn't just a job, it was an inheritance, a way of life, a trap and a lifeline all at once. Most families lived in rows of tightly packed cottages, soot-streaked stone, small fires and large families. The pit was never far from view, nor from earshot. At the Oaks Colliery in Hoyle Mill near Starefoot, hundreds of men and boys clocked in each day. Shifts were long, the work was dangerous. Collapses, gas leaks and accidents were a daily fear, but to most it was simply what had to be done. Miners were paid by the ton, that meant speed, that meant risk. For every ton of coal sent to the surface, someone underground was pushing their body to the limit. Their wives and daughters kept the homes running, cooking, cleaning, worrying, and always waiting for the knock on the door that everyone feared. The pit didn't just take strength, it took lives. But communities were close, they had to be. A neighbour was more than someone you shared a wall with, they were the person who would watch your children if your husband didn't come home. In mining towns like Barnsley, everything ran on coal. The economy, the homes, the schools, the chapels. But the question no one could escape was, at what cost?
Now the site that we've come to visit today is the Barnsley Main colliery. This was one of the most important and one of the busiest coal mines in Britain at the time, and part of it, some of the shafts were absorbed of the original Oaks Colliery. So this is the only place that I can really come to sort of commemorate those victims. Now, it was not far from here then, on a very cold December day in 1866, that something terrible happened. And on that day, it was started out like any normal day for the miners, the men and boys that started their shifts that day, going down into the pit to cut, haul and hew the coal that was powering Britain's Industrial Revolution. So they go down into the mine, and shortly after 1 o'clock on that afternoon, something terrible happened.
Just days before Christmas, Barnsley lay beneath a blanket of snow, the rooftops white, the streets still, the fields quiet. Below the surface, however, the Oaks Colliery groaned with life, a vast underground city of coal seams and narrow tunnels, lit by flickering lamps and the breath of men and boys. The run-up to Christmas meant the mine was nearly at capacity. Few stayed home, few could afford to. The youngest were just boys, pony drivers, trammers, hurriers. Others had worked the coalface for decades. Together they vanished into the dark. And at around 1:15 p.m, it happened. A thunderous roar from deep below. The ground trembled beneath the streets of Stairfoot. Smoke and fire belched from the shaft, carrying soot across the white snow to almost 5 miles away. The air turned black, the silence broke. In Hoyle Mill, where many of the miners lived, women burst from cottages, some in shawls, some in slippers, babies on hips, children dragged by the hand. And they ran, fear in their minds but hope still clinging to their hearts. A newspaper reporter from that time wrote, "To describe the streams of human beings as they rushed to one common centre would be a task of some difficulty. Some ran barefoot, others still dressed for the return of husbands who would never come. At the pit head, the horror was only just starting to unfold, but without haste, the volunteer rescuers began to descend."
Around 2 o'clock, almost an hour after the explosion, 3 men stepped forward.
Together they began their descent into the wreckage. Inside the ruined shafts and amongst heartbreaking cries, they found 20 injured men, burned, choked, broken. They were pulled to the surface as quickly as the damaged equipment would allow.
Of those initial 20, only 6 would survive. On the ground above the pit, panic was spreading like smoke.
Families had started to gather, eyes wide, knuckles white. Matthew Haig, a witness, recalled it clearly. Around the pit head, men were tossed one over the other, and strong men cried like children. The crowd grew with every passing hour, wives in their aprons, children clinging to shawls, neighbours with blankets in their arms. They stood together, helpless, as the full scale of the disaster became apparent. All they could do was watch and wait, as one by one the bodies began to rise. Laid on the cold ground, wrapped in whatever could be found, coats, sacks, blooded blankets. The air underground was deadly. The explosion had unleashed afterdamp, a suffocating mix of gases left in its wake. Rescuers later described it as walking into the breath of death, but still they went down.
Pit ponies and horses played a vital role in the day-to-day running of the mines, like the Oaks Colliery back in 1866. We used to haul heavy loads of coal through dark, narrow passageways, often working in complete darkness for days on end, sometimes for the whole of their lives.
At the time of the explosion, there were many horses and ponies working underground at the Oaks. None of them survived. And one of these, named Tom, gave his life to save a boy. William Henry Hart was just 11 years old. He'd been taking a short rest, sitting in an archway underground, with his arm around his pony Tom. When the explosion came, Tom became a shield. But William, his arm broken, his body burned, lived to tell the tale. He was carried out by William Sugden, a volunteer rescuer. Sugden, however, would not survive to tell his side of the story. The others came slowly as rescuers pushed deeper into what was once a workplace, now described by the press as a vast Golgotha. By midnight, more than 50 bodies had been recovered. Coffins were made at the pit. A death house was set up nearby. Rows of the dead were laid out, waiting for someone to identify a boot, a button, a scar. But many were too damaged. In some cases, identification was never possible. Grieving families waited in the cold. Carts arrived to carry the bodies back through Barnsley's narrow lanes, followed by wailing relatives. The women of Hoyle Mills wandered the streets in shock, skirts soaked, hands and eyes both red with the cold and their tears. And as the night wore on, the snow continued to fall, soft and cruel, over a town that had just become a tomb. But down below the work did not stop. Volunteers from all over the South Yorkshire coalfield had come to help. More than 70 men were allowed underground to assist in the rescue effort, men who understood the darkness. Fathers, sons, brothers, neighbours. They crept through shattered galleries and scorched seams, stepping over collapsed timbers and crawling beneath charred beams. The deeper they went, the more horrifying the scene became. In the engine plain, one of the mine's largest underground roads, they found miners lying where they'd fallen. Fathers and sons embracing, pony drivers and their animals side by side, all of them overcome by the gas, collapsed into the silence together.
Now, at one point, there were so many people turning up to aid in the rescue mission that the colliery workers had to turn them away for safety reasons. It just wasn't safe to have any more men down the pit. So instead, they had to stand up here with the mothers and the wives and the bairns and just wait and pray.
That night, a new figure arrived at the pit, Parkin Jeffcock, a respected mining engineer from Sheffield. When he received the telegram, he didn't hesitate. He caught the next train to Barnsley and went straight to the site. By 10 p.m. he was underground, working with the underviewer, assessing the ventilation, directing the rescue parties, walking through the wreckage by lamplight. All night they worked, but by morning something had changed. The air had shifted. Experienced miners recognised it. A change in pressure, a warning. The signs were there. Another explosion was coming. Around 90 men left the mine, but others, including Jeffcock, stayed behind, determined to finish the job. And then, at 9 a.m. on the morning of the 13th of December, the mine exploded again. A second, far greater blast tore through what remained. The waiting crowd was stunned, the explosion so great it was said to be heard over a mile away. Dense clouds of black smoke once again billowed from the shaft as large pieces of burnt timber hurled through the air, continuing to blacken the December snow on the ground. Parkin Jeffcock was just one face in the dark that day. Like many of the others, he perished underground during that second explosion. His body, like the others, would have to wait until it would not be until the following autumn before it could be recovered. He would have a church built in his memorial to him during the year 1872, and you can still see it if you visit Sheffield. It's the St Saviour's on the High Street. But what about the other rescuers? Where was their memorial?
This is Gloria Victus, which is Latin for glory to the vanquished. It stands here in Barnsley as a solemn tribute, not to the men who died mining, but to those that died rescuing them. It shows Athena, the Greek goddess of war and wisdom, carrying a soldier in her arms. It stands for compassion, it stands for sacrifice. Because those men that died in the Oaks Colliery disaster trying to rescue others weren't just brave, they were selfless. Together they descended into that shaft of the pit, knowing exactly what lay ahead and knowing what risks were at stake. But they descended there anyway. And Gloria Victus stands not just for their death, but for their dignity. Now here on the plaque, I'll read it to you. It says, Oaks Explosion 1866. This monument was erected Anno Domini 1913 by Samuel Joshua Cooper as a tribute to the memory of Parkin Jeffcock and other heroes of the rescue parties who lost their lives owing to further explosions on December the 13th, 1866. Also to commemorate the signal bravery of John Edward Mamet and Thomas William Embleton in descending the pit and rescuing the sole survivor on December the 14th, 1866. In the early hours of Friday the 14th of December, Barnsley was still holding its breath. The mine lay silent, no more bodies were rising, and the last cries had long since faded.
After the second explosion, few believed that anyone could still be alive. But then, a sound. Just before 4:30 in the morning, a signal bell rang from deep below. At first, those at the surface thought it was a mistake, a trick of the wind on the wire, but they shouted down the shaft anyway and lowered a bottle of brandy on a rope. When the bottle returned, it was empty. The pit had become a grave, but it still held a survivor. Steam was raised immediately to power a sawmill engine, and two rescuers, Mr. T.W. Embleton and Mr. J.E. Mammott, were lowered into the dark. At the bottom, they found him, Samuel Brown, one of the 27 volunteers, bruised, soot-covered and nearly unconscious, but alive.
Now this is one of the most moving pieces at the National Coal Mining Museum, and it is the very same kibble that was used to pull Samuel Brown out of the pit that day. I mean, obviously it's got holes and things in it. You can't imagine what it must have felt like for the rescuers to have to go down in this to try and save him. How brave, you know, they were. The fires lapping underground. It must have been terrifying. Now there's a little bit of a plaque on the museum next to the kibble that says this was discovered, discarded and buried close to the shafts of the Barnsley Oaks Colliery, thought to have been the actual kibble used during the rescue operations at the time of those devastating days of December 1866, when over 361 men and boys were killed.
Samuel Brown had been down there for over 20 hours, surrounded by the dead, breathing air thick with gas and fear. He had crawled through collapsed tunnels, clambering over the bodies of his friends. Everyone else was gone. He later recalled, "I remained in the lamp office until I lost my faculties, and remained in that position for some time, after which I began to recover. I then made my way to the bell wire and received an answer from above." What kept him going though in that endless night? Some say it was faith, others say it was sheer Yorkshire grit, but there's a tale, a powerful one, that Samuel, alone in the dark, began to sing. And the hymn he chose was "Abide with Me," a hymn of quiet hope, of steady strength, a plea for God's presence in the hour of death. Abide with me, fast falls the eventide, the darkness deepens, Lord with me abide.
Now a meeting then took place at the King's Head in Barnsley, and it was decided that the fire was uncontrollable, the air below ground was simply not safe, and there was nothing really more that could be done. So the heartbreaking decision was made to seal the shafts.
On Tuesday the 18th of December the work began. The shafts were filled in. Stone, earth and debris were piled into the very tunnels where hundreds of men and boys had worked and died. At least 170 bodies remained inside. Sons, fathers, brothers.
The Oaks site was sealed, and with it, an entire community's heartbreak also sealed.
The grief in Barnsley was said to be overwhelming. Historian Brian Elliott later said that virtually the entire adult male population of several streets in Hoyle Mill were eliminated in an afternoon. In one row alone, Ash Row, there were 30 houses, and in 28 of those, at least one family member had died. John Ashworth, a nonconformist preacher and friend of the poor, visited the survivors in the days that followed the accident. He later wrote, "The angel of death had indeed visited these homes, and a great cry, like the cry of Egypt, had gone up to heaven. Groups of children, many of them too young to understand their loss, were playing about the doors. Some families lost not only the father, the breadwinner, but also 3 or 4 sons. The disaster left 167 widows and 366 children under the age of 12 without fathers. Entire families gone."
The country responded and funds were raised immediately. Even Queen Victoria got involved in the relief efforts. Donations came in across Britain, but there are some things that no amount of money can fix. We're here in Christchurch in Ardsley, which is the final resting place for some of the victims from the Oaks Colliery disaster. Now, they were laid to rest here in a mass grave. There are other victims that are spread out throughout the Barnsley cemeteries, but here at Christchurch you'll find this memorial. Now, it says, erected by public subscription to commemorate the deaths of 354 men and boys who lost their lives in the explosion at the Oaks Colliery on December the 12th and 13th, 1866, of whom 35 are interred here. Now, you'll notice, obviously this says 354, the numbers do change on different things that I've read, so I don't think they know the exact final number, and historians are still arguing that out. Now, if we come round to this side, it says, boast not thyself of tomorrow, for thou knowest not what a day may bring forth. That's quite moving. Now, this is hard to read. Watch, therefore, for ye know neither the day nor the hour wherein the Son of Man cometh. And then here we have, it is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. As I'm standing here today in the cemetery here at Christchurch in Ardsley, it's really hard to comprehend or to put into words what that grief must have felt like. You're probably going to have had about at least 35 families stood around here on that day, watching their loved ones get buried, standing together as individuals, as families, as neighbours, and as a community. And I just don't think I could ever imagine or comprehend or get across to you in this video how that must have felt like. And I think that's why it's so important that we mustn't forget this story.
The Yorkshire Post reported that 169 bodies were never recovered, their remains still buried somewhere in the old pit workings beneath Hoyle Mill, Ardsley, Kendry, Monk Bretton and Starefoot. The earth beneath Barnsley was never the same again, and though time moved on, the families did not forget, nor did the town.
And this is one of the Oaks Bibles handed out to the grieving families. This copy is here at the National Coal Mining Museum. This is the Barnsley Memorial to the Oaks Colliery disaster, the first memorial of its kind to commemorate all of the victims. Now, to some it's known as the Coal Widow. She carries a baby in her arms, and down her back is coal, which symbolises the heavy burden that she carries silently. If we come round the back, so behind her there is a circle, and some say this could represent a few things. It might be the circle of life, it could be a halo, or it could be the pit winding wheel. So it depends what you interpret it as. So you've got your pictures on the back of the miners, and then if we come towards the front again, she stands on top of her husband, who is digging his own grave in a small, narrow seam. And this represents not just her husband, but all of the miners that were living like this on a day-to-day basis. Now, if you look at the lady herself, you look at the Coal Widow, she's said to be facing forward for one reason. She has to move forward. She's got no choice. Barnsley's got no choice but to move forward. Now, if we come to the side, there is a little bit of a plaque here. A memorial for the people made a reality by public donations. Remember where you came from. Remember the land on which we stand. United in this moment is the land on which our ancestors stood, united in their moment. The sculpture was created by a local artist named Graham Ibbison, and I contacted Graham to ask him for a few words about what this statue meant to him.
My considered reason for offering my assistance lies within my personal heritage. I work as a professional sculptor and have done so since 1978, producing over 30 public sculptures in towns and cities across the UK. I was born 2 miles away from the former Oaks Colliery and still live and work within the community of Barnsley, so devastated by the tragic events in December 1866. I am proud to be the son and grandson of a Barnsley miner. My mining heritage in Barnsley goes back beyond 1850, and I was an apprentice electrician with the National Coal Board before I embarked on a career in art. I also have a direct link to the Oaks Colliery disaster through a descendant, George Ibbison, who was killed in the disaster of 1866, leaving a widow and 6 children. Another descendant, Tom Ibbison, was the youngest fatality of the Oaks Colliery disaster in 1886, aged 15 years. My coal mining heritage is littered with tragedy, however, is no different to the descendants of the thousands of mining families in the close-knit communities that lived in the shadows of collieries. This is why I volunteered my services to the 150 Years Oaks Memorial Heritage Project, to keep alive my community heritage and reflect the resilience of the community I now live within. After the shafts were sealed, checks were carried out regularly, and almost a year later the mine was declared safe. As they reopened old tunnels and ventured into untouched chambers, they began to find remains. Sometimes just fragments, a skull, a leg bone, blackened and fragile, and these were sent to the surface. But many were never claimed. No one knew who they belonged to, and so they too were quietly buried.
As I mentioned at the beginning of this video, the Oaks Colliery disaster remains the worst mining disaster in English history, but it also remains as a symbol of silence, of suffering and of sacrifice. And it also showed at the time to Britain what it was actually costing to fuel the empire, to keep those fires burning and to keep the lights on. The cost of life, which was the ultimate price that anybody could pay. And that's what this series is about ultimately. All these pit disasters come at a cost. The cost is human life, and the reward is a growing industrialised Britain at the time. I want to say thank you to everybody that's watched this video. I know it's not been an easy one to watch. It's certainly not been an easy story to share with you. But I do want to say a huge thank you to the National Coal Mining Museum, and in particular Jill and her team at the library there. And an extra special thank you to Steve Wyatt, who was a chap that I met whilst I was in the library. Now, Steve's an ex-coal miner and an avid historian in coal mining, and he taught me lots of things that I didn't already know, and he helped me put some faces to these stories. I hope that you will be kind enough to join me on next week's episode, where we uncover one more pit disaster that happened here in Yorkshire and we commemorate the lives that were lost there. Now, my name's Claire, this has been The Wanderlust Way, and thank you for remembering the children, the men, the boys, the families of the Oaks.